You know, in the story of our lives, in the story that is your life, you are the main character. If you were to write an autobiography, you would be the hero of that story. You'd be the most important character in that story. We'd try to pretend that's not the case. We try to, well, no, certainly not me. But that is the case. If I were to say, hey, I found a picture of your high school graduating class, and I would hold up this picture of high school graduating class, so you're selfish, your eyes would go immediately to try to find where you were. You'd try to find, where am I? Who cares about everyone else? Maybe I'll look for them later. But first of all, you want to see where you are. Why? Why do we do this? Well, we're the most important character in our story. In our lives, we're the ones who decide what's good and bad for us. It's all about us. Sometimes we don't even like to listen to doctors. Doctors try to tell us what to do. We say, I don't know what they're talking about. I know what's right for me. I know what's good for me. In fact, even the reason we go to doctors, Lord, you get your keys this time, Loretta. Yeah. All right. Right there. She got them right. The reason we even go to doctors is so that they can fix us. That's why we go. We don't go to the doctor and say, Doc, I got a broken leg. You go break the other one if you want to, but do whatever you want. No, we go and we say, hey, fix me up. I need help. I need something. I need you to do something for me. We do this even with God. We decide what God should do and what God shouldn't do in the story of our life, because we're the main character. We're the hero. And we have God and we want him to do a certain number of things for us, and we ask him. We call that prayer. But what happens when this happens? Let me ask you this. Have you ever prayed for something, and it didn't come to pass? It didn't happen the way you wanted it to? Raise a hand. Anybody ever had that happen to them? I'm surprised, honestly, there's people who didn't raise their hands. Who doesn't like to raise their hands? Raise your hand. Who doesn't like to raise their hands? But boy, isn't it difficult? You pray and pray and pray for something. And I don't mean to make light of this. I'm not making light of this. It can be difficult. It throws us off. It's difficult when that happens. When you pray for something, that's good. It's not like it's terrible. You pray to avert a tragedy, or you pray that a death wouldn't happen. And then when it doesn't happen, though, when it doesn't happen the way we ask, it's difficult. It throws us off. We start wondering, what's God up to anyway? I thought are you even there? Some people stop believing in God when this happens. They go to God in prayer, and there's people who don't believe in God for that very reason. You ask them, they say, well, I tried praying once for something that was really a good thing, and it didn't happen. I had to go through a terrible tragedy. God didn't answer my prayer, so he's not there, so I don't believe in him anymore. It's difficult when it happens to us. It's our lives are our story. It's our plot. It's our characters. We want to decide what's good and what's bad and what's right and what's wrong, and we want to decide what happens to us. We don't like it when things outside of us happen to us, when it starts changing our story. We want to be the author of it. We want to say, I know what's best, I know what I want, and I know what I'm praying for is good, God, so why aren't you answering it? And so, like I say, some people just don't believe. And maybe it was a tragedy, like I said, that God didn't stop. And I get it. It's a struggle. I'm not saying it's not a struggle. It's a bigger struggle, I think, to go through tragedy when we have those unanswered prayers. But why do we call them unanswered prayers even? We call them unanswered prayers because we wanted something and we didn't get it the way we wanted it. So we call it an unanswered prayer. And we decide, well, God didn't do the right thing in this instance. The right thing is obviously to answer my prayer. In those times of unanswered prayers, or maybe tragedy that God didn't avert, what happens to our faith? What happens to your faith? What happens to your belief in God? When you have those unanswered prayers, what do you do? What's your reaction to that? We're going to read about 3 guys today, who are going through a trial, and they have a very interesting reaction to what's happening to them. We're in Daniel chapter 3. We're going through the book of Daniel, this series. If you have your Bibles, you can open up to Daniel chapter 3. These stories in Daniel are kind of long, so we do a lot of reading as we're going through Daniel, but it's good. I hope you guys can appreciate us going through Daniel and not saying, I'm sick of so much Bible, too much Bible. No, I hope you guys are with me through this. If you haven't been here or you forgot or a little foggy, the book of Daniel takes place after the Jews have had their own country for a while. They've had King David and King Solomon have already come. They've built a glorious temple. They used to be this great, great country. Then there was a civil war. They were divided, and before long, they were off worshiping other gods. They forgot about God, and the Assyrians came and destroyed the northern country. And then later, the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, this guy who's one of the big characters in the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came and destroyed Judah. He destroyed the temple, and he took some of the Jews to exile back to Babylon. And that's where the book of Daniel takes place. Daniel and his friends are Jewish people who have been taken out of their land to Babylon and are living in Babylon now. They're living in exile. And in the first chapter, Nebuchadnezzar found some of these Jews that he thought were impressive. They looked good. They were intelligent. And he said, I'm gonna train up some of these Jews in the Babylonian ways, and they're going to be helpers to me in my kingdom. And Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were four of these Jewish guys. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't actually their real names. Their Jewish names were Hananiah, I put myself on the spot, Mishael, and Azariah. And then King Nebuchadnezzar said, I want him to have Babylonian names. I don't want him to have this Jewish identity. I want to have a Babylonian identity. And for some reason, the rest of the book of Daniel refers to them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refers to them as their Babylonian names. Later on in Daniel chapter 2, what we read last week, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that he wanted his wise men to interpret. And he didn't just want him to interpret the dream, he wanted the wise men to tell the king what his dream was without him telling them in the first place. None of his wise men were able to do it. When Daniel and his friends heard about this, they prayed, and God gave them the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had. And Daniel went up to the king and said, this was your vision, if you remember that from last week. And the vision was basically this gigantic statue, the head of gold and body and arms of silver and a waist of bronze and legs of iron. And he said this statue is like the human kingdom. He said, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold, and there's all these other countries that are going to be coming after you. They're going to be world empires. He said, but in the times of that fourth empire, the Roman Empire, the kingdom of God is going to come on the scene. He said there was a rock not cut by human hands that destroyed the statue and grew to a huge mountain that filled the earth. It's the kingdom of God. And Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of chapter 2, is very impressed by Daniel. Because obviously it's an impressive thing to do, to be able to tell someone not only the interpretation of the dream, but even the dream itself, without you telling them first. And so the very aftermath of this, in Daniel chapter 2, what we read last week, it said, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods, and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. So here's the end of chapter 2. This is where we're at now. And it seems like King Nebuchadnezzar is very impressed with Daniel and Daniel's God. But this sentiment that the king had doesn't appear to stick. Like many people, Nebuchadnezzar had an experience with God, an experience of God. He was impressed by God's power, but it didn't appear to change his actions or anything about him. Nebuchadnezzar never really had a relationship with this God. He was just kind of in awe of him, and then he just kept on doing his own thing. Right after this, in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar decides to build a giant idol for himself and have everyone pray to it. That's his reaction to this thing. He's very impressed with God and what God has done, but it doesn't really change anything about him. And he goes out and he builds this gigantic statue. And now here's the background before we get into the verses that are in your bulletin there. Here's what he does. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 6 here. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, which my Bible says is 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, which is a weird dimensions, this weird stretched out statue. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. So, all those people and all the provincial officers assembled before the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. This guy Nebuchadnezzar. We read last week, whoever is not able to interpret my dream, I'm going to murder them. If no one's able to do it, I'm going to murder all the wise men. He's got I don't know if he's got anger issues. I don't know what's wrong with this guy, Nebuchadnezzar. But he builds this giant statue, and he says everybody's got to worship it, and whoever doesn't, I'm going to throw him into this blazing furnace. And you can read in the history books about this guy, Nebuchadnezzar, and that apparently was one of his preferred methods of execution, throw somebody into a furnace. And so, again, here we are, and it's interesting, I think, that he sees, in the very last chapter, first of all, he sees the power of God and what God's able to do, and he recognizes that this God is really powerful. But then, what does he do? He builds a giant statue. It doesn't say what it is, it just says an image. He builds this giant statue, and I think maybe a lot of people assume it's an image of himself. And I think it's strange that he just had a dream about this statue of himself and all these worldly kingdoms, and Daniel says, but that statue is going to crumble. It's going to fall. And God's kingdom is going to be the thing that survives. And then his reaction to this is say, I ought to build my own statue. It seems like he didn't really learn anything about this. But Nebuchadnezzar, for some reason, he wants everybody to worship this thing. And maybe it's for national solidarity. Maybe he wants people to come together and salute how great the nation is and thank you to the gods for creating the nation of Babylon or whatever. Who knows what it is. And there's some people in Babylon, if they're like us, they're probably complaining about it. Some guy's working. It's like, what do I got to do? I got to go. What does he want us to do? The king, he wants us to worship at this statue. And then, like a lot of people, they say, whatever, okay, fine. I got a lot of work to do at the office, or I got a lot of work to do at the shop, but take some time out, pray to this thing, and then get on my way. Some people might think it's weird, but then they probably would start rationalizing it. What is it an image of? Okay, well, I'll pray to it, and I'll just pray to, I'll pray to something else, but I'll just do whatever the king wants, and I'll just get on with my life. And we might think it's weird, have a king come and, have people bow down to this big statue. I want to show you a picture that was taken last year in North Korea. This picture was taken last year in North Korea. Isn't that interesting? We don't really change much as a species, do we? That's Kim Jong-il and whoever his predecessor was. That just happened last year. Idolatry is everywhere. It doesn't have to be a big statue. It doesn't have to be a big fancy thing. It doesn't just mean idols. It means anything that you're placing before God, anything that you're putting up before God. And in this instance, it's a little dangerous because the king is forcing everybody to do this. And everybody's apparently going along with it. But idolatry is everywhere, especially in America. We build statues, we don't worship them, but we have all sorts of other idolatry that we don't even realize is idolatry. My family and I were watching some kind of weight loss show. There's all sorts of weight loss shows. And this guy comes on, he's this fitness guy. He's all excited. He's a big, huge, buff guy. And he goes, he looks right at the camera and he goes, I believe that fitness is the highest form of human expression. And we're like, what a goofball. But then I thought, boy, that's idolatry, isn't it? Fitness is the highest form of human expression? Okay, here's the thing that's great, fitness, right? But then all of a sudden you're elevating it to the highest form of human expression. That's called idolatry, basically. And I remember asking my kids are sick of watching TV with me. I say, whoa, highest form of, I go, is that right, kids, you think that? They're like, Dad, I don't care. I go, what do you think? What do you think is the highest form of human expression? Is that right? And they're like, I don't know. Do we have to talk about this? But I try to have these teaching moments. And I say, well, what is it? Is it love? That sounds like a little better one. Maybe worship? Well, maybe worship's the highest form of human expression, but we ought to be thinking about this. If we're not, we just see some doofus on the television telling us it's fitness, and we say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. No, it's idolatry. If anything's an idol in America right now, it might be weight loss. There are so many people that give all their whole life to weight. Everything's fitness and losing weight. Again, a good thing, but elevated to the most important thing, the highest form of human expression, it's called idolatry, guys. We're living in a country where it's becoming more and more important to have the right opinion. Here Nebuchadnezzar is, he's got this, state, maybe it's a holiday, maybe he's offered everyone a day off of work, and he wants everyone to come together and have this national solidarity, and whoever doesn't is thrown into the furnace. Boy, doesn't it seem like we're going just closer and closer toward that in this country? We live in a country where to have the wrong opinion than everyone else, than whatever the official opinion is becoming more and more dangerous. All of a sudden, your opinions will lose you'll lose your job, you'll be publicly shamed. Just in my mind, it seems like we're becoming more and more dangerous as a country. But then there's these three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that decide not to partake in any of it. Here's this big statue, we're going to worship it. These three guys, they don't make a big fuss. They don't, go out there and wave signs, you guys are all going to hell, you guys are doing the wrong thing. They decide, I'm not going to partake in that. They just don't do it. And maybe that works for a little bit, but pretty soon they're found out. Somebody looks at them and says, hey, you know what, these guys aren't participating, and they get tattled on. So here's what happens next. It says, at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. They're always kissing Nebuchadnezzar's butt. May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. That whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I set up? So here's it's coming to a head here. Now, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were quiet about it. They weren't participating. They were standing on their convictions, like they did in the first chapter, with the food that they were trying to feed them. But in this time, it didn't really help them out. Now they're ushered before the king, and the king is giving them an out. They're saying, all right, guys, you guys need to worship this statue. And these guys are saying, no, we're going to stand on our beliefs. We're going to stand on our convictions. Now, it would be far easier to say in this moment, you know what, yeah, okay, fine, it's not that big a deal anyway. I thought, okay, guys, we're just going to pray to this thing, and, let's just pray to our God instead. We'll just pretend like it is. That would be the far easier thing to say. And I think that would probably be what a lot of us would do. It gets, you're in front of the king, and he's threatening you with his big furnace. All right, I guess this thing is not that bad. But here's what happens now, and this is the verses that we're going to be looking at today in your bulletin. Nebuchadnezzar continues. He says, now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image that I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into a blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. Now I want to stop there. And the reason I want to stop the story here is because as far as these 3 guys are concerned, as far as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are concerned, this is where their story ends. As far as they know, this is it. Nebuchadnezzar is furious with them, and he's also arrogant, isn't he? He says to them, what God is going to be able to save you from my hands? And it's like, wow, who does this guy think he is? This guy has no idea who the God we serve is. But you know what? Sometimes we convince ourselves of the same thing. Sometimes when we're going through trials, when we're going through struggles, we tell ourselves, how is God going to save me? How is God going to rescue me from this? We see Nebuchadnezzar saying it, we think, boy, that's arrogant, isn't it? He doesn't know who God is? But we tell ourselves that stuff all the time. And we kick ourselves saying, I don't know how God's going to deliver me from this. There's no hope that's going to be able to come from this. There's no good that's going to be able to come from this. And sometimes we find ourselves saying to God the same thing. How are you going to do anything about this? We're showing that same distrust of God as King Nebuchadnezzar did when we do that. Well, why do we do that, though? Why do we find ourselves when we go through trials? Why do all of a sudden it just seem hopeless? And I think the reason is because we're the main character of our stories. We're the ones who decide what God should do and what God shouldn't do. And sometimes we find ourselves without hope. And when we're the main character of our story and we have no hope, then we don't know what God's going to do, so we feel hopeless. So we think since we don't know what God's going to do, then God isn't able to do anything because we're the main character in our story. If we don't have the answer, then certainly God doesn't have the answer. So we say, well, this situation is hopeless. I don't have any hope, and God's not able to do anything. And we end up saying and accusing God of the same thing that King Nebuchadnezzar does, that God's not going to be able to save me from this. Now, these guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fun names to say. I never get tired of saying those names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these guys are interesting because they aren't the main characters in the book of Daniel. But the very interesting thing about them is that they also aren't the main characters in their own story. If you asked Shadrach or Meshach or Abednego, if you asked them to write an autobiography, do you know who would be the main character in that story? God would be. God would be the main character in their autobiography. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're not focused on their decision. They're not focused on their outcome. They're not focused on getting their results. They're focused on God's decision. And their trust and their hope and their comfort comes from whatever God decides. Whatever God decides to do with us, we're good with. Because he can deliver us either way. Whatever way he wants to, we're going to leave that up to him. Listen, I want you to listen to their response again to King Nebuchadnezzar. This is one of the greatest moments in all of Scripture, in my opinion. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. And then they say, if we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. Now here's probably 6 of the most powerful words in the whole Bible. But even if he does not, we're still going to worship him. We're still going to follow him. These 6 words, these are some of the most important words for you to remember. But even if he does not, but even if God does not, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I don't know what God's going to do. I don't know what outcome God has in all this. I don't know the big picture that God has, but I know that God knows. But I know that God can. And knowing that God can isn't good enough. Even Nebuchadnezzar knows God can. God can do those things. He's seen God work. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have trust in that. They not only know that God can do it, they give their lives to him and they say, God, whatever you want to do, because this is not my story, this is your story. I'm just a character in your story. This phrase, this 6 words, but even if he does not, this phrase is how you can tell really why you follow God. Because for us, and I think a lot of us come to God for this way. I know I did. We come to God selfishly in the beginning. Maybe you've heard about hell and you think that's a terrible place and you don't want to go there. So you come to God. And that's a selfish reason. You want to go to hell. Or maybe you've got a struggle that you're going with and you don't have any other options. And so you've tried all your options and now here you've heard about this guy God and you want to try him next. Again, it's selfish reasons. And I think starting that way is okay because, that's just who we are. But, staying in that place is not going to be sufficient. As we grow with God, we need to realize we need to make God really the main character of our story. We need to take ourselves out of that place and say, you know what, God, you're the main character in my story. And I want to do not what I want to do. I want to do what you want to do. And that phrase, but even if he does not, that's going to tell us in our hearts, am I following God out of love for myself, or am I following God out of love for him? This phrase needs to be a part of your life and your prayers because it's going to expose your heart. It's a tough prayer. It's not going to be it's not a pretty or easy thing to say. You're going to wrestle. You're going to wrestle with God. When you're praying desperately to him for something, for deliverance maybe, for something good, boy, it is the 6 of the hardest words to say. God, but even if you don't, boy, that's tough. Man, that's tough. But you need to pray that prayer. Some days you need to pray it over and over and over again until there's nothing left but you and God. until there's nothing there. And then when that happens, God comes in such a powerful and strong way, and you realize, you know what, God, I don't need anything more except you. I don't need anything more. All those things that I'm praying about, you know what, I don't even need that. I just need you. But that is not an easy battle. That's a lifelong battle. I'm going to be honest with you, I can barely pray that prayer sometimes. When I'm praying for God to protect my kids, and I say, but God, I can hardly get the words out. I just say, but God, you better do what I ask. And it's a wrestling. God, but even if you don't, I'm still going to worship you. I need God's help to even pray those words. Our trust should not be in what we want God to do. Our trust should be in who God is. God, well, like we looked at last week, He not only holds all time in his hands. He not only can tell the what has come before and what will come to pass, but God holds all life and death in his hands. And I want to put my trust in that person. I don't want to put my trust in my own decisions, my own wants, my own results, my own outcomes. I want to put my trust in that God. And this is the hardest thing that you're going to hear today, hopefully. And it hurts to even say it. But like I say, you aren't the main character in your life. Your kids, I know this hurts. Your kids are not the main character in your life. I know it feels that way. God is the main character. And when we trust in him, it's amazing things happen. Maybe not the things you want to have happen, but amazing things happen. When you start walking with him, we just, tax season was just to happen. And it's the easiest thing in the world to do taxes kind of your way and to fudge everything in your favor. And you say, well, all right. How much money to make? Well, not that much. How much did I give? Oh, I gave a whole ton. It's the easiest thing in the world to fudge the numbers, and so you can get more money, so you can get what you want. But you know what happens when you trust God and you're just honest? You say, I'm just going to be honest about this whole thing. Maybe you won't get as big a refund, but I'll tell you what you will get. You will get God walking with you. You'll get God defending you. You will get God doing all sorts of things that you have no idea about. And it's the best thing in the world that you don't, because you don't want to know what God is, because God's the main character. You're just a character in his story. And so they answer Nebuchadnezzar's challenge. They say, no, we're not going to do it. God's powerful enough to deliver us, and he'll deliver us through in life, or he'll deliver us in death. Either way, we're not going to worship you. We're not going to worship this thing. Whether God delivers them, that's why I wanted to stop there, because whether or not God delivers them, they already won. They already beat Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's got nothing on these guys. They say, I'm not going to follow you, I'm going to follow God, and I'm going to let him decide what he's going to do with me. But we do want to finish the story, and we want to see, well, what did God decide? It says, verse 21. It says, so these men wearing their robes, trousers and turbans, and other clothes were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. They didn't even give them a chance to do anything. They said, tie them up, throw them. They're out. They're done. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there three men that we tied up and threw into that fire? They replied, yeah, your majesty. He said, look, in the furnace I see four men walking around there, unbound, unharmed. And the fourth looks like a son of the gods. He's a Babylonian. You got to forgive him for his language. Looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not even harmed their body, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was not even a smell of fire on them. And Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him, and they defied the king's command, and they were willing to give up their lives rather than to serve or worship any god except their own God. Boy. As I put the sermons together, I pray every week, God, what do you want me to say to your people? What do you want me to say in the sermon? And a lot of times I don't really hear much. I just kind of do my best. I say, God, I hope you're guiding me in this. But this week, as soon as I prayed that, God, what do you want me to say to your people? I heard right away, you tell them that I will be with them. You tell them that I will be with them. I'm there in the furnace. I'm there in the trial. I'm there in the struggle. I'm there in the pain. Here's another lesson for you that you're not going to want to hear. God delivers you in the fire, not from the fire. Many of you are in the furnace right now. And maybe you prayed you wouldn't end up here. Maybe you're praying to get out of it. And that's good. That's perfectly fine. But just know that God delivers you in the furnace, not from it. Why does he do this? Boy, that's the question, isn't it? Why does he do this? I don't know the answer to the question because I'm not the main character in your story. God is. He knows the answer. I was just reading a book. It's a good Christian book, and at the end, all these people are brought forth before God, and God says, you're allowed to ask me one question. And boy, this guy's question that he asked, I just wept as soon as I heard it. He said, God, why did you let me get hurt so bad? I don't know. But at the end of the story, Nebuchadnezzar praises God. He sees what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went through, and we see what they went through. And what's the result? Well, there's praise and worship as the result. We go through trials, we go through the furnace, but we come out with a testimony. We come out with a story. And it's not a testimony about us, it's a testimony about God. And it's not a testimony for us, it's a testimony for God. Not that people would say, wow, that's amazing that you went through that, but people would say, praise God that he was with you in that furnace. We talk about these Bible characters like this, and we imagine that they were never worried or they were never nervous. These great Bible heroes, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We sing songs about them. We say somehow, they're so much. Boy, isn't it great? I wish we could all be like that. And we look at ourselves and we say, I could never do something like that. We feel guilty all the time, and we feel nervous. We feel anxious. We feel doubtful. I got to imagine that these guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these guys were nervous as anything. Maybe they weren't, but I got to imagine that at some point they're sweating pretty bad. Trust is a scary thing. It is. You ever do that trust fall where you fall back and someone catches you? That's scary. Trusting is scary. It's okay to be anxious. It's okay to be doubtful. Don't stop judging yourselves that you're not some great hero who's never anxious and never doubtful and never scared, never worried. I bet you these guys were all those things. But you know what? Their hope isn't in the strength of their faith. Their hope was in God. Their hope wasn't in the strength of, how much faith they had that God would do this thing that they wanted to do. Their hope and their strength was found in God and what God wanted to do. We need to remember it's not about us, and it's not about our feelings. It's not about what we feel as we go through these things. D.A. Carson, another favorite author of mine, he writes that there's two types of believers. And he says, imagine that there were two Jews during the time of the Passover in Egypt. And the last plague is about to come. The angel of death is going to come and take the firstborn of everyone in Egypt. And God had said, if you put the blood of the lamb over the doorpost, you'll be safe. He says, now imagine these two Jewish believers. He says, Smith and Bob, good Jewish names. And he says, imagine they're talking to each other the day before. And the one says, aren't you nervous about tonight? Man, I am so worried about this. And the other one says, well, what are you worried about? You slaughtered the lamb, right? You sacrificed the lamb. You put the blood over the doorpost. Yeah, I did that. Well, you're going to have the Passover feast. You're going to do all the things that God told our servant Moses to do, right? You're going to do all those things, right? Yeah, I'm going to do all those things. Well, you'll be fine. What are you worried about? Well, the angel of death is going to be coming through. Aren't you a little worried? I've only got the one kid. You've got 3 kids. Maybe you don't need to be so worried, but this is a scary thing, and I'm really nervous about this. These two types of believers that we have here, the confident one and then the kind of the nervous one. And he asks, in the next morning, which of these two lost their son? He says, neither. Neither one lost their son. Why? They weren't delivered on the basis of how they were feeling at the time. They were delivered on the basis of the blood of the lamb over the door. That's what delivered them. That's what they're standing on. That's what they're hoping in. That's what saves them. You may be nervous. You may feel untrusting. You may feel like you're not even able to pray that prayer, God, but even if you do not, I want you to know that your assurance before God doesn't come from your confidence or your strong feelings. Your assurance before God comes from what Jesus has done for you. Your assurance before God, you're standing on nothing but the blood of the Lamb. Not what you have done for him, but what he has done for you. And when you stand before God one day, don't you dare say, I tried pretty hard. God, I know I messed up. I know, I hope you don't think I'm so bad. I went to church, I did all my prayers and that kind of stuff. I did the best I could. Don't you dare say that. When you stand before God, you need to say the words of that old hymn, I have no other argument, I have no other plea, but it is enough that Jesus died and that he died for me. That's what we stand on. When it gets rocky, when you're feeling like you can't handle it, don't put your trust in those feelings. Put your trust in the blood of the Lamb, what Jesus has done for you. Amen? Let's pray.